Okay, we're in the final chapter of Genesis this evening, chapter 50. In this section, which began really in chapter 46, we saw the move of Jacob and his family down to Egypt from Canaan, and then Jacob's final days in Egypt and his death. And last week in chapter 49, we had Jacob pronouncing these blessings upon his 12 sons there, and each blessing being appropriate to the character of the son and what the future would hold for each of them. There's a prophetic element in those blessings as well, looking forward to what they would become when they were the 12 tribes of Israel. And then at the end of chapter 49, there was the account of the death of Jacob and the instructions that he gave concerning his own burial. So chapter 49 ended with his death in verse 33. When Jacob finished charging his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. And then we go straight into chapter 50. The story continues on immediately into chapter 50. So we'll read here verses 1 to 3. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for it, for so many are required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. When Jacob died, then we're told that Joseph fell on his father's face, wept over him and kissed him, displaying the deep affection that Joseph felt for his father. Joseph then commanded the physicians to embalm Jacob. The Egyptian belief in the afterlife necessitated the preservation of the physical body, as it was believed that one day the soul would return to the body, so the body would be needed. And not only humans, but animals were also embalmed as well. And the process of embalming, we're told here, took 40 days. The process itself was quite complicated. It involved the removal of the internal organs of the body, apart from the heart and sometimes the kidneys, which were left in the body. The brain was then removed through the nostrils by using metal probes and hooks to pull the brain out. And then the organs of the body, such as the liver, the lungs, and the stomach and the intestines, were each preserved in jars. The body was then packed with a mixture of chemicals to ensure the rapid dehydration of the body in order to prevent decomposition occurring. The chemicals were then removed from the body, which was then washed with water and perfumes. The skin was anointed with resin, and the body was packed with linen and then wrapped up in linen, which was soaked in the resin. The embalmed body would then often be placed in a coffin, depending on the status of the person. There were different levels of embalming according to how much you were able to afford. Just as today, various prices are given for funerals depending what sort of funeral you have. And well, it was much the same in Egypt in ancient times as well, depending on what your requirements were. So the Egyptians then, we're told, wept for Jacob for 70 days, an indication of Joseph's status in the land of Egypt and their high regard for his father, for Jacob. Jacob himself was a sort of ordinary person, but it was Joseph who was the important character, and so the Egyptians paid respect to Joseph's father because of who Joseph was. The 70 days of mourning here would probably include the 40 days that had been taken for the embalming process. So in verses 4 to 9, then we read on Genesis chapter 50. And when the days of weeping for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, "If now I have found favor in your eyes, speak, I pray you, in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, My father made me swear, saying, I am about to die. In my tomb, which I hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan, there shall you bury me. Now, therefore, let me go up, I pray you, and bury my father, then I will return." And Pharaoh answered, "Go up and bury your father, as he made you swear." So Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen. It was a very great company. So at the end of the days of weeping, these 70 days, Joseph asked Pharaoh's servants to speak to Pharaoh on his behalf. He probably doesn't speak to Pharaoh directly and asks the servants to do it on his behalf because Joseph is in mourning, and it wouldn't be proper or appropriate for him to appear in the presence of Pharaoh in that state of mourning. And so he asks the servants of Pharaoh to speak on his behalf and asks permission for him to go and bury his father in the land of Canaan. And Joseph emphasized that his father had made him swear that he would bury him in the tomb he had hewed out for himself in the land of Canaan. Joseph also promises to return to Egypt when he has done this. So he would not be using this as an opportunity to resettle in Canaan in his homeland, but his intention is to come back to Egypt. Pharaoh held Joseph in high esteem, and so he granted him permission to go and bury his father as he had sworn to do so. And we're told here a very great company of people left Egypt with Joseph in order to do this. The list is given there of all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, all the elders of the land of Egypt, the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. And they were accompanied by chariots and horsemen as well. So it must have been a grand, impressive sight to see this funeral cortege making this journey, which is another indication of the respect that Joseph and Jacob had gained there in Egypt. When we think about Queen Elizabeth's funeral and what a great occasion that was, and all the dignitaries and the crowds of people who turned out for that, well, this seems to be something similar. Something perhaps not on the same scale, but certainly something significant was taking place there in Egypt when Jacob was taken from Egypt back to Canaan. The only ones left behind in the land of Goshen, we're told, were their children and their flocks and their herds, and that would indicate their intention to return to Egypt once the funeral had taken place. We come on to verses 10 to 14 then. When they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they lamented there with a very great and sorrowful lamentation, and he made a mourning for his father 7 days. When the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning on the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "This is a grievous mourning to the Egyptians." Therefore the place was named Abel, it is beyond the Jordan. Thus his sons did for him as he had commanded them. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field at Machpelah to the east of Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. So they arrived at this place called the threshing floor of Atad. We're told it was beyond the Jordan, and there they publicly lamented for Jacob with a very great and sorrowful lamentation. The location of this threshing floor of Atad is unknown. It hasn't been identified. And Joseph, we're told here, mourned for his father for 7 days. And 7 days was the normal period for mourning amongst the Hebrews. When the Canaanites saw what was going on, they saw the mourning, they said, "This is a grievous mourning to the Egyptians." So they identified this large group who had come as being Egyptians, and they recognized that this was a significant event. And so they gave the place where this was happening the name Abel Mitzrayim, meaning meadow or mourning of Egypt. Mitzrayim is the Hebrew name for Egypt, and Abel is the word or mourning. There may be a play on words going on there, a similarity between the words for meadow and mourning. So this is the name that they give to this place where the great mourning of the Egyptians. Well, following on ceremony, Joseph and his brothers then took Jacob's body for burial. Jacob's sons thus fulfilled his wish to be buried in Canaan, in the cave of the field of Machpelah to the east of Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. This is in accordance with the instructions that Jacob had given to Joseph back in chapter 47, verses 29 to 30 there, that when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, and this is when Joseph swears that oath that he will bury him there in that cave. So there in the cave, Jacob was laid to rest with his grandfather Abraham, grandmother Sarah, his father Isaac, his mother Rebekah, and his wife Leah. And then after the burial has taken place, Joseph and his brothers and all of those who had accompanied them returned to Egypt as Joseph had promised to do. Okay, well, they get back to Egypt, and verse 15 down to verse 21 continues the story here. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil which we did to him." So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, forgive, I pray you, the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did this evil to you. And now we pray you, forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." But Joseph said to them, "Fear not, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he reassured them and comforted them. Following the death of their father Jacob, Joseph's brothers were anxious that he would now take revenge upon them for the way they had mistreated him in the past. They perhaps thought that Joseph was storing up this grudge against them, and now that Jacob was dead, he would use that opportunity. But in thinking this way, they had misjudged Joseph very badly, that Joseph is not harboring any ill will or grudge towards them at all. So after so many years of apparent peace between them, the brothers still have this sense of guilt hanging over them, over what they had done to Joseph. And perhaps being unable to face him themselves, they sent a message to Joseph saying that before his death, their father, that they refer to him as your father, addressing Joseph, he's your father, that he had asked that Joseph should forgive his brothers for their sin and transgression and for the evil they had done to him. Whether Jacob had actually told them this or not, we don't know. But this is what they say to Joseph. This is the message that they send. And they describe their actions towards Joseph in these very strong terms as transgression, as sin, and as evil, an acknowledgement of the wrongdoing that had been done. And the brothers then asked for Joseph's forgiveness, describing themselves as the servants of the God of your father. So they see themselves as being God's servants here, the God worshipped by Jacob. But Joseph wept when he heard this, when he heard their words. He is overcome with emotion. We've seen that earlier when he was in the presence of his brothers before making himself known to them. He was overcome with that emotion. And again, here on this occasion, his brothers came to him in person and they fell down before Joseph and they declared themselves to be his servants, offering themselves again as his servants. And again, they're fulfilling the dreams that Joseph had had as a young man, in those dreams when Joseph had seen his brothers bowing down before him in the form of the sheaves of wheat and the stars. But Joseph responded to them graciously. He told them not to be afraid, and he asked them, "Am I in the place of God?" It was not his place to take any vengeance upon them. He wasn't playing God in this situation. And although they had meant to do evil to Joseph, God had used the situation for a good purpose, so that many people should be kept alive. And this was what Joseph had told them when he first revealed his identity to them back in chapter 45 from verse 4, where he says to his brothers, "Come near to me, I pray you." And they came near, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither ploughing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God, and he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt." So these were the same words that Joseph had said on that earlier occasion as well, that yes, you meant to do me harm, but God used it for a good purpose. God brought some good out of that situation. And Joseph's life is really that example of the working out of God's providence, of divine providence. Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 9 shows us the providence of God here as well. Proverbs chapter 16, verse 9, which says, "A man's mind plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps." We can make up plans in our own minds of what we intend to do, but in the end, it is the Lord who's in control. The Lord directs the steps. And in Proverbs chapter 19, verse 21, similar statement here, "Many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will be established." And then the words of Paul in Romans chapter 8, verse 28. "We know that in everything God works for good, with those who love him, who are called according to his purpose." So good can come out of bad situations, out of evil situations, and out of the evil that people do to each other. God is able to use those events to bring about some good. And so on this occasion, Joseph urged his brothers once again not to be afraid, and he promised to provide for them and their little ones, to continue to support them. Again, evidence that he had truly forgiven them. And so in this way, he reassured them and he comforted them. So there's this full reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers, and that was the outcome of this. Well, the final verses now in chapter 15, final verses of the book of Genesis. So Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's house. And Joseph lived 110 years, and Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were born upon Joseph's knees. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph took an oath of the sons of Israel, saying, God will visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. So Joseph dwelt in Egypt along with his father's household, and he lived until he was 110 years old. He was 30 years old when he was released from the prison and when he appeared before Pharaoh. So 80 years has passed since that time. And several years before that, when he was taken into Egypt. So he has spent practically his whole life there in Egypt. And we're told here that he lived to see Ephraim. Remember, Ephraim is his son. He lived to see Ephraim's children to the third generation, and the children of Machir, Manasseh's sons, were born on his knees. So these are his great-grandchildren. He lived to see his great-grandchildren, and this idea of them being born on his knees suggests again his prominence and him being the head of the family. And when he was about to die, he called his family together to him and told them that God would visit them and bring them out of Egypt and take them to the land that he had sworn to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the land of Canaan. And Joseph then had the sons of Israel swear an oath that when God visited them, they would carry his bones with them out of Egypt. And so Joseph died at the age of 110. We're told at the end here that he was embalmed and his body was put in a coffin there in Egypt. Coffins were more commonly used in Egypt than in other nations of the Middle East at that time. You can go to the British Museum and see many examples of the coffins and the mummies that have been found in Egypt there. So this is the kind of thing that happened to Joseph. And again, as happened with Jacob as well, Joseph is also embalmed there and placed in the coffin. The book of Genesis begins with life in the garden, but it ends with a coffin in Egypt, and see the great development of that story through the book of Genesis. Joseph's words here concerning the Exodus and his bones were fulfilled, as we see in Exodus chapter 13 and verse 19, when the Israelites left Egypt under the leadership of Moses. Pharaoh finally agrees to let them leave the land, and verse 19 of Exodus 13 says, and Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had solemnly sworn the people of Israel, saying, God will visit you, and then you must carry my bones with you from here. So that was something that they had remembered and that they had recalled through the years, that Joseph had made that prediction that they would leave that land. God would bring them out of that land. And when that happened, they were to take his bones with them. That was the confidence, the faith that Joseph had. We see the burial of Joseph in Joshua chapter 24 and verse 32, when the people finally get into the land after spending 40 years in the wilderness, and finally under Joshua they come into the land. Joshua chapter 24, verse 32, towards the end of that book. The bones of Joseph, which the people of Israel brought up from Egypt, buried at Shechem, in the portion of ground which Jacob bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of money. It became an inheritance of the descendants of Joseph. So finally, after many long years, Joseph's bones, his body, finally laid to rest there in the land of Canaan. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 22 records Joseph's faith, which he displayed in his final words, and his confidence that God would take his people back to the promised land. Hebrews 11 verse 22. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his burial. So it was an expression of his faith that God would do this, that God would finally bring the people out of Egypt. When they've grown to become this great nation there in Egypt, that God would take them and take them into the land that he had promised to give to Abraham and his descendants. And so we come to the end of Genesis. A few thoughts on this chapter for us to reflect upon. We've got in this chapter a long account of, I think it's the longest account of a funeral or the death practices that are taking place at that time, both with Jacob and with Joseph in this chapter. And we see them expressing their wishes to their family, and that perhaps leads us to think about our own deaths. And have you had conversations about your own death? What do you want to happen to your body? And Joseph and Jacob both had plans for what would happen to them, and it's important. It's difficult to talk about these things, but it is important as well. What can we learn about reconciliation from the example of Joseph? We see that once again here in this chapter as well. And have you seen God bringing good out of a bad situation, as he did with Joseph? And how does God keep his promise to Abraham that we see here? So those are a few thoughts from chapter 50. If we think back over the whole of the book of Genesis, and we've been studying it for most of this year. We started in January, we're now in November, so it's taken us most of the year to work our way through this book. But just to recap very briefly on what we've looked at here, we've looked through so much really. In the first 11 chapters, we divided the book into the two sections. First 11 chapters provide us with the story from the creation through to Abraham. So we had the perfect world which God created. We had Adam and Eve and the introduction of sin into the world and death as a consequence of that. The story of Cain and Abel, Noah and the flood, and the Tower of Babel, all there in the first 11 chapters. And then in the longer section of the book, from chapter 12 through to chapter 50, it's really the story of God's promise to Abraham concerning his descendants and the promise of the land. We see the development of that promise through the events taking place in these chapters. So we have the transmission of the promise from Abraham to Isaac rather than Ishmael, Isaac being the promised child, and then the transmission of the promise to Jacob and not Esau. And then these stories of faith from these great characters of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, and their life stories and the lessons we can learn from that. And then we see the beginning of the fulfillment of the promise there in Egypt, with the book ending in Egypt with Jacob's family in Egypt and the development there of the Israelites into that nation, which would grow. And then finally, God would bring them out as Joseph anticipated and take them to that land which God had promised to them. So that's a quick review of the book there. So we will stop here. And if anyone has any thoughts or comments, not only on what we've studied this evening, but